Welcome to AskPsychSessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thank you for joining us today. My guest is Annie Maheux, who's a graduate student at the University of Delaware. Thanks for coming on to chat today, Annie. So Annie, I don't know you, but I get a weekly email from the Character Lab, and I believe in December you got to be an essayist for that. So could you just give the short recap for our listeners rather than basing it on my memory of what I read about you a month ago that sounded worth discussing?
Sure, of course. So I have been fortunate enough to collaborate with the Character Lab, which is an amazing organization that collects school-based data on behalf of developmental researchers. And through the Character Lab, we were able to collect data from over 700 high school adolescents leading up to and then during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we found that during that period, teens who reported an increased reliance on social media for having meaningful conversations with their close friends also reported increases in gratitude over that same time. And importantly, the frequency of social media use was not related to gratitude. So this kind of suggests that social media use to foster social connection, but not necessarily all social media use might have some benefits for teens.
All right. Thank you. Yes. So I found this to be really intriguing because I think, as I believe you opened the essay, I think often we think about how we need to be reducing our social media use and how it's taking time from other things. And your work is showing that there can be benefits. So if my Googling is correct and my scheduling memory is correct, this is going to come out in between what is called Quitter's Day, when people often lose their New Year's resolutions, and Blue Monday, which tends to be some of the sadder parts of the year, right? The dark winter, end of January, the holidays are over. So, and the beginning of the semester. So given what you've written about and this, how can our listeners who are professors use this information about relationships, either from this study or from your other work, to think about both in and out of the classroom? How can we encourage behaviors that might be more helpful?
Sure. I think when it comes to digital media, which is the context in which so many of our relationships are happening right now during the pandemic, especially for adolescents, which is the population that I study, I think social media use gets kind of a bad rep. You know, people think that interactions on social media are overwhelmingly negative, or they're superficial or transient. And what our study shows, and what sort of a burgeoning literature is starting to show, is that there are benefits on social media, and there are benefits to using digital media to connect, especially in this time when it's maybe safer to do so than to be in person. And what I think is important for parents and for teachers to consider is that social media or digital media and digital interactions can really have benefits. And those benefits are probably mostly accrued when we're using digital media in an intentional way that fosters meaningful interactions between close friends or acquaintances and within communities. And this, the study that I conducted was with adolescents, but I think we can all take something away from this, which is just that it's far too easy to pull out our phones and take the path of least resistance by scrolling passively or even zoning out when we're in Zoom meetings with our colleagues or our friends. And if we want technology to really facilitate some degree of well-being or engagement with students, I think the research suggests, and I'm of the opinion, that we need to really use it smartly and with the intention of creating those meaningful interactions with others.
So if you'll talk a little bit about what your life is like now as a grad student who is heading into their 5th semester, which, if you do a 5-year program, that's half of a doctoral program under pandemic conditions. And in light of your research, have you seen ways that that this has played out and made this either a better or worse experience, either in how you've had to do your research or lab meetings or keeping up relationships? Just maybe for our listeners that are supervising graduate students and just thinking about the proportional amount of their time that's being spent on these conditions as compared to me. It's my 5th semester teaching in a pandemic, but I'm in my 16th year and I hope to teach for a long time after this. So it's only going to take up a much smaller percentage. So what are some things, whether it's about your research or just your general experience, that you think would be helpful for listeners to be thinking about?
Sure. So I have a somewhat unique experience, which is that I'm a 4th-year graduate student, but I did the first 2 years of my training at a different institution at the University of Pittsburgh. And then my advisor moved jobs and came here to the University of Delaware. And so I transferred as a 3rd-year student in the middle of the pandemic, when there was no in-person anything happening. Everything was remote, and it was really hard to try to meet people and form a community and get to know the department that I was now a part of. And luckily, my advisor and my lab mates are just phenomenal human beings and have been just supporting me endlessly throughout the process and making the transition more manageable. But I know for a lot of students, that's not the case. And they lack the support that they need from their advisor or mentors or from peers. And I especially feel for students who are starting grad school during the pandemic. I think what's really important for those students is that there are structures in place for them to have mentors, to have peer relationships, and to have opportunities to ask questions and get professional development training and feedback more broadly.
All right, great. Well, I am glad that that piece has been going as well as it could be for you. Maybe we could also talk a little bit about your teaching assistant experience. So if you could just give a quick recap about any teaching that you've been doing, teaching assistant or during the pandemic, because I think I have some follow-up questions, but I'll adjust them based on what you've been up to.
Sure. So I have not been a teaching assistant during the pandemic. I was a teaching assistant all 4 semesters prior to the pandemic. So I have plenty of teaching assistant experience. But what I have been doing, which hopefully is relevant to some listeners, is serving as a graduate student mentor to undergrads and post-baccalaureate students and even other graduate students that I work with. And that experience has been in large part shaped by the pandemic, as students' interactions with those other folks have been online primarily. And as we're all kind of struggling, a lot of those mentorship experience have been not only professional development experience, but also helping people manage just the stress of the everyday life of living in a pandemic. And through those experiences, I guess one thing that I've tried to do that I've found to be helpful for people who mentor me is kind of blur the lines in I think appropriate ways between the professional and the more personal experiences that I have with my mentees, and really try to support people as whole human beings rather than see our relationships as more transactional.
And would you mind giving an example about how, in a lab meeting, you can keep that balance? Or when you're checking in about how the studies are going?
Sure. I mean, the first example that comes to mind is an undergrad student who I've been mentoring for about a year now, who in large Zoom meetings struggles with speaking up, as I do as well. I think being in a Zoom meeting with a lot of people present is really isolating, actually, because there's no opportunities to have kind of side conversations or one-on-one chats with people before and after. And so as much as we try to make those bigger lab meetings safe places for people to share their thoughts and ideas, and then creating one-on-one opportunities for students to talk about research ideas or to talk about their career plans more broadly has been something that I've tried to do. So I've created opportunities to have one-on-one interactions and in person, outside as much as possible, and where that's safe, to try to foster those relationships that are I think, really challenging to build in large Zoom meetings.
I am taking a big note on this because I do feel that my lab meetings have not been as enjoyable, and I attributed part of it to just pandemic fatigue. But I think you're right. It feels so much more under the microscope in that situation, because everyone really is looking right at you. So that is a great tip. All right, I'm going to think about more individual meetings, more breakout rooms, and maybe more time for just sharing what's going on a while. I'm not going to be able to remember the guests, but they mentioned at the beginning of their class, they had people put in the chat, like, what's not great, and just kind of get it off your chest before you get started. And then at the end, okay, well, now let's end on a high note, like what's something that is going well. So thank you for that reminder to bring that in, and all the other factors that are happening at the same time, right? Like you, I'm sure, are seeing kind of as an advanced grad student, as threat might be aggressive, but certainly like someone that you want to impress, or at least appear like you know what's going on to, which is hard to do when you're brand new to a lab and haven't read any of the background literature. So thank you. That is helpful. Okay, Annie, I usually like to let our guests also have a chance if there's something that they would like to share. So it could be something about your research, something about mentoring, something about teaching. No one's ever given a really great recipe recommendation, but maybe that also could be an option, right? Whole people. You aren't just a scientist. So is there anything you would like listeners to know about relationships, or about you, or if you're recruiting for your lab to send great undergraduates for the doctoral program?
Sure. So one thing that I think is relevant to this conversation, although maybe doesn't always come up as being directly relevant to the classroom, is just the role of relationships in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and initiatives, and kind of more generally the role of relationships and feelings of belonging and well-being for students from marginalized backgrounds and students of color in particular. I've really found, in large part from transferring to a new university where I don't know anyone and trying to get involved in these efforts, that strong social bonds and communities is really the only context in which we can have difficult conversations about the inclusivity of our departments and maybe things that need to change. And it's really with these strong established relationships and with feelings of trust between people that are across different levels of the academic hierarchy, that we can, say the wrong thing, but still assume people's best intentions, or apologize and forgive each other, or that we can really hear each other when people try to point out something that's not working, when there's a major issue related to inequities or just flat out racism that we really need to come together to solve. And during the pandemic, our relationships have been really taxed by being almost entirely online. And so I think that this is something that, we can all reflect on, especially perhaps teachers and professors, and thinking about how these relationships might be really important for students from marginalized backgrounds and for DEI efforts in our departments.
Thank you. I wish that I had known you were going to end that way. I would have been even more excited about your answer, because I think that, right, we've been on the AskPsychSessions podcast been trying to highlight, and that I think what you said right there is a good reminder that DEI efforts are always at play, and we need to always keep them front of mind. So thank you for sending us out with that. I appreciate it greatly, and I appreciate your time. I've been chatting with Annie Maheux from the University of Delaware. Thank you.